שלום, אני שרון לוזון, תודה שהצטרפתם אליי לשיעור היסטוריה. אנחנו תכף מתחילים. בשיעור הקודם עסקנו בשלביה המוקדמים של השואה. הבידוד הפיזי בגטאות, ובמקביל ההחלטות בנוגע להשמדת העם היהודי. יותר ממחצית היהודים שנספו בשואה נרצחו ב6 מחנות השמדה. 6 מחנות בסך הכל, שבהם הובלו אל מותם כ3.5 מיליון בני אדם. משפחות, ילדים, קהילות שלמות. 6 מחנות ההשמדה, אושוויץ, טרבלינקה, סוביבור, בלזץ, חלמנו ומיידנק מוקמו בפולין. הנאצים העדיפו שמחנות ההשמדה היו בפולין, מאחר שרוב האוכלוסייה היהודית התרכזה באזור זה. ומכיוון שהניחו שהאוכלוסייה המקומית תסייע או לפחות לא תפריע לתהליך. 3 מן המחנות הללו, סוביבור, בלזץ וטרבלינקה, הופעלו במסגרת מבצע ריינהרד. במהלכו נרצחו 1,700,000 אנשים תוך 1.5 שנה, בשנים 1943. מחנות ההשמדה האחרים, ובתוכם מחנה ההשמדה הגדול מכולם, אושוויץ, המשיכו בפעילותם השטנית ממש עד לסופה של מלחמת העולם. התוכנית הראשונה שנשדר היום תעסוק במחנות ההשמדה, מחנות המוות, ואילו התוכנית השנייה תעסוק בהתנגדות, הלחימה היהודית כנגד הנאצים באירופה הכבושה.
Summer 1944. We only knew that there were transports going to the east. That was the expression that was used. But otherwise we didn't know anything.
Trains were taking people to their deaths from all over Europe.
The Jews, rightly or wrongly, have the reputation of being shrewd and cunning, and they perhaps don't like to admit to it, but we are fooled completely.
The gate at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Few people guessed where the journey would end.
Let me tell you, I'd never heard the word of Auschwitz until I reached it.
Then my father said, "What can you see?" And I said, "It's getting quite light here." Then I was able to tell him more. I can see barbed wire, I can see watchtowers, I can see men with rifles, with machine guns, soldiers and SS men. Then I said to him, "I can see people in striped clothes." Then he said, "We're in a concentration camp." The train hadn't quite stopped, but the carriage doors were torn open and the command, "Get out, get out," was screamed at us. "Leave your luggage in the carriage." So then we jumped out, and then there were orders, men to the right, women with children to the left, women without children further to the left.
Pictures from an SS guard's photograph album.
There was sun, and you know, if in the middle of the night you light a lamp, you can't see for a minute. And that was the same feeling I had, because it was rather dark inside. And I couldn't see, but then I thought, nice, fresh air, no smell of death, no dogs.
The ramp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The selection.
I saw him standing there with his feet splayed, his hand up, and his finger going from right to left, from right to left. And on one side I could see old people, ill people, women, and what was worse, women with children.
There was a young woman who appeared to be about 20 years old, holding a baby. I went up to her and I bent down and whispered that she should give the baby to me, because I still had something to eat left in my luggage. But when I said that she should give me the baby, she started to cry and would not let it go. So I went away immediately and hid.
Small children were sent straight to their deaths with their mothers.
He looked at the children and said, "Don't take the children's hands." I looked at him and said, "Why not?" And he said, "One day you'll understand."
Families on their way to their deaths.
On the tracks, I saw a little girl whom I didn't know. She was crying and looking for her shoes. I went straight up and took her hand, but this prisoner was just behind me. Through clenched teeth, he said to me angrily, "Didn't you understand what I said?" Straight away, I thought, here is danger. I let the little girl's hand go, took her to the other children, and went over to the other side. This image pursues me till now. I can still see the little girl. Did I have the right to let go of her hand? Did I have the right to live? That's the question I've been asking myself all these years.
In the spring of 1941, Hitler was planning his war of annihilation against the Soviet Union.
That was his aim, to steal extra land. The annihilation of the Jews was actually his second aim. The most important was to get more territory, to be a world power.
This was the main camp of Auschwitz near Krakow. It was once a Polish barracks, but had become a murderous concentration camp for prisoners from Poland and Germany. Rudolf Höss, the commander of Auschwitz, came from the concentration camp at Dachau, as did the phrase, "Work makes you free."
Arbeit hat in Auschwitz niemand frei gemacht, sondern das wirkliche System war Vernichtung.
In Auschwitz, work made nobody free. The real system was destruction through work. That meant the prisoners were forced to work as long as they could, and if they couldn't anymore, they were shot or poisoned, or later sent to a gas chamber.
In June 1941, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, away from the front line, the special Einsatz units were mass murdering Jews.
First Lieutenant Picher, a reserve officer, had travelled with SS officers in a train from Kharkov to Leipzig, and they had been showing off about doing what we know today the Einsatz units did. And he asked me, "Can it be true?" I must say, at that time, I didn't know any of the details. "Can it be true?" he asked me. And I answered, "Can you make such things up?"
Sigmund Sobolewski was a political prisoner in Auschwitz.
At that time, the biggest problem in Auschwitz was a typhus epidemic. And not only the prisoners died, several guards died of Auschwitz, of typhus. The civilian workers who were working in Auschwitz were protesting about it. They didn't want to work in Auschwitz anymore because so many of them were affected with typhus.
An insecticide, Zyklon B, was used in Auschwitz against the lice which carried typhus. This promotional film was made in 1938.
Blausäure, die ja äußerst giftig ist, eignet sich zur Schädlingsbekämpfung ganz besonders. Hier ihre einfachste Anwendungsart. Man lässt sie von porösen Gipswürfeln aufsaugen, die dann in gewöhnlichen Blechbüchsen gasdicht verschlossen werden. Mit Blausäure durchgast man größte Betriebe ohne jede Gefahr für Mensch und Material. Gas! Gas!
You had to get completely undressed and give up all your things, which were then thrown into a kettle, where the lice were supposed to be killed. The things were either supposed to be washed or have the lice killed, I can't remember which anymore. The naked women had to then stand on chairs, on 2 chairs, and the men shaved them. They were shaved in all the personal areas.
In August 1941, hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners of war were under German control. Officers, communists and Jews were all to be shot, either at the front or in the concentration camps. But some were taken to Auschwitz.
Some of them were killed already on a railroad station. Some of them were brought to a Kiesgrube. There was a, in front of the entrance to the camp, there was a Kiesgrube number 1, which is now non-existent. It's all filled out. And some of them were killed over there. If there were any officers or under-officers or Jews or communists or Politruk, the assessment continuously asked, who is the Jew, who is the Politruk? And they were killed right away before they entered the camp.
This was Block 11, the death block, where Auschwitz guards carried out an experiment.
What I noticed when I was cleaning, especially on the outside of the block, that all these openings to the basement were covered up with dirt, with soil. And I was wondering why they covered it all up. It was all covered up. So they made it like airtight, the whole building.
On the night of September the 6th, concentration camp guards drove 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 250 sick prisoners through this door.
What later I found out from this Leichenträger, those are the people who are removing the bodies, they told me that many of those bodies had like a bluish foam on their mouths. Some of them had a bluish stuff coming from the noses and from ears. And they say that there was gassing there because the first Leichenträger who went to the basement, they gave them gas masks as well, the prisoners who were dragging the bodies out.
The experiment was deemed to be a successful one. The first murder with Zyklon B.
It was the first time in human history when the killing of people was reduced to an industrial process, and something that removed the humanity from us all.
The Russians still alive were to become forced laborers. Since the autumn, a huge camp had been erected next to Auschwitz for the prisoners of war.
There wasn't a single blade of grass there. There was only hard clay soil. There wasn't a single tree, let alone any flowers. There were no birds flying over Birkenau.
While the first barracks were put up in Birkenau, the methods of killing by gas at Auschwitz were improved. The first gas chamber was built in the crematorium.
It was a kind of a perverse work of high technology, German high technology.
Hitler had propaganda photographs taken of some of his wounded soldiers. The German campaign on the Eastern Front was faltering. There were fewer prisoners of war available to work. In January 1942, Himmler ordered them to be replaced by Jews. In Auschwitz, too, anybody who couldn't work was condemned to death straight away.
Weshalb es Juden und Bakterien und Läuse und Flöhe und Ungeziefer aller Art gibt, ich weiß es nicht. Juda wird und muss vernichtet werden. Das ist unser heiliger Glaube.
If you had the power to reduce people to a level that would in normal circumstances be unthinkable, then you can say,
They are not human, and I am not going to treat them as human beings. The SS men who threw the poison gas cylinders into the gas chambers were officially called disinfection officers, or pest control operatives.
April the 20th, 1942, was Hitler's birthday. While he was celebrating, the first Jews arrived at Auschwitz. This is the old ramp of Auschwitz-Birkenau. From June 1942, hundreds of thousands of people were sent from here to their deaths.
People arriving by train were transported to the camps by lorry. Healthy people, together with the sick and the dead. They had to get undressed in little barracks, and then, naked, they were herded into the bunkers. On the doors of the bunker, it said, "To the washroom," as though they were going to be disinfected.
These are the ruins of a farmhouse in Birkenau. It was converted by the SS into a gas chamber.
Then a car drove up that had a red cross on it, and it brought the gas, Zyklon B. The SS man filled the room with gas through a little window, and people suffocated as a result of the gas.
SS Chief Himmler came to inspect Auschwitz in July 1942 during a visit to the front. He was taken to inspect the death process. Himmler always used the same words to praise those involved.
Von euch werden die meisten wissen, was es heißt, wenn 100 Leichen beisammen liegen. Wenn 500 da liegen oder wenn 1000 da liegen. Dies durchgehalten zu haben. Und dabei, abgesehen von menschlichen Ausnahmeschwächen, anständig geblieben zu sein, ist ein niemals genanntes und niemals zu nennendes Ruhmesblatt.
The men who worked there comforted themselves with the idea that they were put in this terrible situation and had to do their duty for the people, the fatherland, and National Socialism.
These were ordinary men who had power over life and death.
Well, that's what Auschwitz was like, but you can only really grasp it when you think it right through to its final consequences. But that was the routine. That was the daily routine.
In Katowice, in Poland, in July 1942, the evening after his Auschwitz visit, SS Chief Himmler pronounced himself satisfied with the progress of the murders. But one of his companions spoke out, and the news of the murders reached Geneva.
What was going on there was worse than you could imagine. I struggled for 2 days over the possibility of whether it was all really happening. Today we know that 6 million Jews were killed, but if you're told for the first time that an order is being given for 3.5 or 4 million Jews to be killed, is it possible? What kind of world do we live in?
In August 1942, Gerhard Riegner informed the free world. What could the Allies do?
Remember, at the high point of the crimes, Hitler controlled continental Europe. His armies reached from the Atlantic to Moscow.
In August 1942, Hitler was in his headquarters directing the last big offensive to Stalingrad. In Vinnytsia in the Ukraine, Adolf Eichmann's team was finalizing the plans.
2 weeks before we got the news, Western Europe embarked upon a massive persecution of Jews. In all the big cities, Amsterdam, Antwerp, Brussels, Paris, Marseille, Lyon, tens of thousands of Jews were arrested on the same day, the 14th to the 15th of July 1942. Some of them had already been sent to the east, and nobody knew why it was happening. What had suddenly happened? Why were these mass arrests taking place?
In the summer of 1942, 80,000 Jews lived in Amsterdam. Now they were all condemned to death.
Dann wurde das sogenannte Judenviertel abgeriegelt.
The so-called Jewish quarter was closed off, and a car with a loudspeaker came through the streets and said, "Attention, this is the German police. You will be fetched from your homes. Get ready, take a rucksack, some food and covers. Nothing will happen to you. You will work in Germany."
A Dutch doctor risked his life by secretly making this film in 1942. Jews left their homes, never to return. On the same day, their furniture was confiscated.
What's going to happen? How will this end up? What will they do with us? Will we be beaten? Will we be punished? Will we have to join the SS or the security police? Nobody knew what was happening or what was going to happen.
This was a Westerbork camp in Holland, a station on the journey to death. The destination, Auschwitz. Young Jews like Hans Margulis had to help.
We had to fasten the doors. They didn't touch anything. The local police chief was with his SS people and the police who accompanied the train. He just walked up and down with a German shepherd dog. They didn't want to get their hands dirty.
The cattle trucks were loaded with people for their journey to the death camps.
You normally would transport cows like that, I suppose, and sheep. And in this case, they put human beings in. So you were standing up most of the time, and there were no sanitation, not meaningful sanitation, perhaps a bucket in a corner or something like that. That was the time when really the whole weight of all the facts came tumbling down. You were no longer considered a human being.
This was where people arrived on the ramp at Birkenau. Those that survived selection were destroyed in the camp.
You had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. There was a cup of coffee and a little piece of bread. That was our breakfast. Then there were exercises. The whole camp had to run around, lie down, stand up, lie down, stand up. And if you couldn't manage anymore, an SS man would hit you on your back. And that's what it was like at the beginning for 2 weeks. It was cruel. And we called to God. Please help us, dear God. But God didn't help.
Danger was everywhere.
The most important thing at Auschwitz was bread, having a little bit to eat, and shoes. And they were stolen every night. Every night you heard shouting in the block, "My shoes have been stolen. They've stolen my bread." And if we found them, we'd punish them. If somebody stole once, he would do it again.
Victim was set against victim. It was all part of the plan.
One day a man clambered onto my mattress from behind, and I knew exactly what he wanted. I wanted to scream, but suddenly his hand came up to my mouth, full of bread. And I ate the bread because I was hungry. And then he did what he wanted to. When he'd gone, I noticed that he'd stolen my cap. Throughout Auschwitz, a prisoner at morning roll call without a cap was a dead prisoner. I'm sure that this man didn't want any witnesses to what he'd done. He knew that I'd be shot at morning roll call. But I wanted to survive, so I pinched a cap from another prisoner. I'd never seen him before. I don't know what his name was, whether he was young or old, whether he was a Jew, a Pole, a Frenchman, a German or a Spaniard. I've no idea. The next morning, this prisoner was shot. I had survived. The most terrible thing was that the Nazis made me, as a victim, do things which, as a normal human being, I would never have done.
This is what Auschwitz did to people, the victims and the perpetrators.
One lovely day I went into labor, and Mengele came to see me, and he gave an order that my breasts were bandaged, so I wasn't able to feed my child. My breasts were bandaged with some rags, and the child started to cry because he had nothing to eat. And then came a doctor who worked there, a Jewish woman doctor, and said to me, "I brought you an injection, give it to your child." And I asked her, "What sort of injection is it?" And she said, "It's just morphine." I thought I couldn't hear her properly. I said to her, "Do you want me to kill my own child?" And she talked and talked and talked until I just had no resistance left. I killed my own child.
In November 1942, in a Munich beer cellar, Hitler made a speech.
Sie werden sich nur erinnern an die Reichstagssitzung, in der ich erklärte, wenn das Judentum sich etwa einbildet, einen internationalen Weltkrieg zur Ausrottung der europäischen Rassen herbeiführen zu können, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Ausrottung der europäischen Rassen, sondern die Ausrottung des Judentums in Europa sein. Sie haben mich immer als Prophet ausgelacht. Von denen, die damals lachten, lachen heute unzählige nicht mehr. Die jetzt noch lachen, werden in einiger Zeit vielleicht auch nicht mehr lachen.
Just how much did people know about Auschwitz?
Jeder in Deutschland hat gewusst, dass es KZs gab.
Everyone in Germany knew that there were concentration camps and that people were taken there without any proper trials. This behavior on the part of the German state should have been reason enough to cause anger. But nobody in Germany knew what was actually going on in the concentration camps, because even those who were released from them were not allowed to talk about it. So in their own interests, they didn't talk about it, because otherwise they'd have been arrested again immediately.
In Dresden, on November the 23rd, 1942, Jews were told to clear their flats.
People must have seen that the flats were suddenly empty. It can't have remained a secret. That people did nothing about it, that's another matter. We don't want to discuss that, but I cannot imagine that people didn't see what was going on.
In March 1943, Jewish families were deported from Dresden to Auschwitz.
The moment passed like a flash when you said to yourself, something terrible is happening there. But what and how and where, you didn't know. You really didn't know.
By Christmas 1942, 5 months had passed since Gerhard Riegner sent his telegram.
I sat here and looked at Mont Blanc and the Blue Lake and waited for some news. German soldiers were only 5 kilometers away from here, at the Jewish cemetery in Vergey, the border. 5 kilometers away was where hell began. When I was sitting in these lovely surroundings, looking at the lovely lake and the lovely mountains, and couldn't do a thing. It was an awful position to be in.
On December the 17th, 1942, the Allies reacted. In the House of Commons, a declaration condemning the perpetrators was read out. MPs stood for several minutes of silence.
Politicians like Lloyd George wrote in their memoirs, "There's never been anything like this before." You thought that something would happen. But nothing happened.
At Christmas in the Vatican, Pope Pius XII referred to the mass murder in his message to the world.
Questo voto l'umanità lo deve alle centinaia di migliaia di persone, le quali senza aver una colpa propria, talora solo per ragioni di nazionalità o di stirpe, sono destinate alla morte o ad un progressivo deperimento.
Saving the Jews was not at the top of the Allied agenda or the Pope's agenda, as murdering the Jews was at the top of Hitler's agenda.
In the mountains, Hitler celebrated Christmas with the children of his employees. On the radio was a Christmas concert to his soldiers.
Achtung, ich rufe noch einmal Stalingrad. Hier ist Stalingrad. Hier ist die Front an der Wolga. Das schöne, alte deutsche Weihnachtslied. Bitte Nacht. Bitte
The Christmas tree in Auschwitz was lit, and the guards sang Silent Night. The next day, An SS man went through the men's camp. He had wanted to go home for Christmas, but hadn't been given any holiday, and so he took it out on the Jews. He shouted, "Happy Christmas," and shot one after the other.
On January the 9th, 1943, in East Prussia, there was a state visit to Hitler's headquarters. The Romanian head of the armed forces, General Antonescu, was Hitler's ally in the war against Stalin and the Jews. But Hitler didn't discuss the mass murder that was taking place.
Many may not believe what I'm about to say, although I was right in the thick of it all. I didn't hear anything about Auschwitz until after the war.
In fact, Hitler was continuously updated on the progress of the killing. What he didn't know was that his radio operators were listening in and teaching their juniors to do the same.
You must listen in, my son. You must listen in carefully, and then you will know what a pack of criminals you are living amongst. And then he showed me, during the night shift, how you could do it without being discovered, with a sharpened match. And it worked.
There was a telephone call from SS Chief Himmler for Hitler's secretary. It was about the number of people who should be killed every week at Auschwitz.
Himmler rief Bormann an und sagte sinngemäß, ich habe eine gute Nachricht.
Himmler called Bormann on the telephone and said, "I've got good news for the Führer. In Auschwitz, 20,000 Jews have been liquidated."
Unterbrach ihn Bormann sehr barsch.
But Bormann interrupted him angrily and reminded him of his obligation to think of what the Führer had commanded, and that was that news relating to this subject should only be sent by courier direct to Bormann personally, and he would then pass it on.
Despite stringent security, inhabitants of the surrounding area soon knew what was going on.
Although we only lived about 30 kilometers from Auschwitz, we didn't know that the camp was an extermination camp, killing people by gas. But by the end of 1942, the first news had started to filter through.
We got the first news about Auschwitz from my brother, Hans Deichmann, at a very early stage. Somebody had said to him, "You can see what's going on there. You can see the smokestack. You can see the smoke. That's people."
Very few people in Germany actually knew what was happening. How did they live with the knowledge?
You could hardly live if you knew everything. You couldn't sleep if you'd thought about such things. I said to myself, I mustn't think about it, otherwise I just won't be able to carry on. So I won't think about it. I put my head in the sand.
For the Germans, everything changed after their defeat at Stalingrad. A few still managed to enjoy life, but for most it was now a question of survival.
For example, my sister wrote to us in a letter from prison that for the first time she'd met somebody who'd come back out of Auschwitz, and everything that had been said about Auschwitz was true.
What could people do if they knew?
If I look back, as young as I was, I'd already prepared myself for the idea that I'd be murdered somehow. I'd prepared myself for the idea that that was the way it was going to end.
At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the insignificant building at the end of the ramp was hardly noticed by anyone. It was the first of 4 crematoria with gas chambers built for the mass murders.
I was asked, "Is your mother with you?" And I replied, "No, she's on the left." Instead of answering, he led me to the door and opened it. There were flames, reaching right up to the sky from a chimney. And he said without any emotion, "That's where she went, up the chimney." I thought, now why is he talking nonsense like that? I thought, poor chap, he's completely lost his marbles.
Personal possessions were left behind.
Gaskammer hat mir auch nichts gesagt. Was ist Gaskammer? Gas chambers didn't mean anything to me. What were gas chambers? What did they mean? Our mind isn't constructed in a way that could make sense of it. And how could the people on the outside believe it? They weren't there when we were standing in front of the gas chamber. We didn't believe it. It was mad, and so it wasn't true.
Many spent months in Auschwitz-Birkenau before they fully understood.
I heard loud screaming and went out of the block, although during the night you obviously weren't allowed to go out. There were the tracks leading through the door of death into the crematorium, and I saw the trains, and I heard the screaming of women who were being driven inside. And then the flames came up out of the fireplace. And for the first time, it was quite clear to me that they weren't sick people. They weren't corpses who were being burnt, but they were living people who'd been brought in and were being killed and burned. That was the first I knew of the mass deaths of people who weren't brought into the camp, but were simply taken direct from the train into the crematorium. In August 1943, it was the first time that it had really sunk into my consciousness.
In the crematoria, Jewish prisoners had to do the worst work of all.
We saw another transport coming. Living human beings, lovely human beings. And we knew what was going to happen to them.
The little wood in front of Crematorium 4 was the last stop before the gas chamber.
The Germans were telling them, "You're going to get some hot showers. Make the shoes tied zusammen." I remember that, to tie the shoes together. So when they're coming out, they got to find the shoes together again for the people. So the people were not suspicious that they were going in the gas chamber.
Deceived until the moment of death. These photographs showed Jewish women just before entering the gas chamber.
The people in there were still laughing. And they were still asking where they were. But we could only be quiet and not say anything about what was going to happen to them. If we had told them, they would have suffered even more. They would have started to scream and cry.
Crematorium number 2, few came out alive.
I said to myself, Samuel Pizarre, you are now in the face of the ultimate and absolute moment. And I saw in the corner of the barrack a bucket of water and a big brush. So I crawled over there and I took the bucket and the brush. Maybe it was a nervous reaction and nothing else in the face of death. And I started to scrub the floor, wash the floor, until I came to the exit of the barrack where 2 SS guards were staying with their carabines on their shoulders. Seeing me there scraping, they must have assumed that I was there to do a job. And then I came, there were 3 steps. I stood up, I picked up the bucket, I put the brush on my shoulder, and I slowly walked out, waiting any moment for them to yell, "Halt, where do you think you're going?" Nothing. And in a few minutes, I was in the camp among the other prisoners.
Today, the gas chamber at crematorium number 2 lies in ruins.
They closed the door, and 3,000 people at a time. I was getting away from there. I could stand at the voices. They were calling in Hebrew, Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad.
The scream was our most holy prayer, Shema Israel. But the SS man turned it into a German phrase, Schmeiß rein, which means chuck them in.
At the Majdanek concentration camp, this gas chamber has been preserved.
And 20 minutes later, or 30 minutes later, when they open up, what did I see? I saw the same people that I saw 20 or 30 minutes ago, all black and blue, dead, standing up with the children there. And he says, my God, I says, how can I survive in such an environment?
When the gas chambers were opened, the people were standing up. They died standing up. They stood like that, next to each other. Some had even linked arms, and they died like that. Excrement and urine was everywhere. Anything they had with them was on the floor. All in a muddle on the floor. It was a tragedy.
The ovens made by Topf and Sons in the Buchenwald concentration camp. They're identical to the ones in Auschwitz.
After the burning, we had to sieve out all the bits of bone that were still left over and make them smaller. There were 3 different sieves, large, small, and still smaller. And they were sieved and sieved until the ashes were as fine as dust. When there was enough dust, a cart came along, and they were taken to the Wisła, to the river Wisła, and the dust was shaken into the river.
One prisoner witnessed the horrors inside the crematorium.
And look at the site, he said. Look at the site. Look at the walls. People have been scratching with their nails, struggling in their final death throes. And then he showed me some tongs. We put them round their necks, and then we pulled them out. And I said, and then they're burned. No, he said. Then they go in that room over there, and if they've got gold teeth, they're taken out. And then, he said, then they go into the ovens.
Und dann sagt gehen Sie in die Ofens rein.
More than 1 million Jews were murdered here. Only once did a human being survive the gas.
When they opened the doors of the gas chamber, we heard some crying. What it was, I think, was a baby on top of the dead bodies, crying. He didn't get killed from the gas. So we called the German, we said that somebody is crying and so on. He didn't get them too much, the German. He went in with his gun. He shot him and he killed him. It was kind of a miracle, but the German killed him.